My friend Rick. Okay, good deal. So what's happening here, folks, is that this is the presentation I did last night, June 31st at 5:30 p.m. or 5:30, yeah, p.m. at the Tribal Auditorium, but that the slides weren't advancing on the screen that you saw versus the one that I was using. So I told Lena Sconchin that I'd go ahead and just do the presentation over at home. That's what we got. So we're going to get the presentation. Unfortunately, we're not going to hear the questions and answers that we had afterwards. So, well, welcome. It's great to be back again. As always, thank you for your interest. Thank you for turning out last night and the day before, either in person or on Zoom. And a continuing thanks to George Lopez for asking me to do these presentations. And I still have a couple more I want to give. And as always, thank you, Lena Sconchin, for getting everything set up, coordinating it all. So what I'm going to be doing today is going to be a little different from before. All right, even though I'll still be relying largely on myth and ethnographic materials in order to identify much of the imagery like I usually do, my main goal here today is to discuss the different purposes that rock art served in our culture. And what I mean by this is that while many rock art symbols denote supernatural medicine, like Homokamsha's sun disk or Skell's medicine stick, others are intended to provide people with supernatural assistance for things like, believe it or not, gambling, aka gambling medicine. And still others depict the visions witnessed by shamans or shamans in training as they sought out encounters with the spirit world through trance, especially as it pertained to the acquisition of the very first spirit helpers. Now, each of these activities resulted in distinctive kinds of rock art, and in fact, that's what we're going to be doing this evening. We'll be looking at examples of each, throughout this presentation. So, that all being said, let's start with encounters with the spirit world. Okay, first off, let me move this little screen up here so it's not in the way. There we go. Now, what you're seeing in the slide here is what's called the Holding Hands Petroglyph site. The site itself is approximately 1,500 meters up in the mountains and located firmly within the traditional Modoc homeland in the southern Klamath Basin. The site itself is a single panel located beneath a rock overhang containing 59 engraved stick-figured human forms, joined at the hands and arranged in 3 rows across the rock face. And who knows how many more beneath the lichens down there. Now, as you can see, some of these figures actually appear to be moving to the right, suggesting that this scene here represents a dance or a procession. That might be something important to keep in mind. Now, like I said, the site is located about 1,500 meters up in the mountains, well above and away from the Modoc villages that once dotted the banks of the Lost River below. Well, if we consider this isolated location in conjunction with the fact that the panel itself is only 160 centimeters wide and 80 centimeters high, and that none of the stick-figured humans measure over 10 centimeters high, well, then I think we can safely say that this rock art panel was not intended for dramatic public display. By contrast, its relative isolation from population centers, coupled with evidence for power questing activities above the site, which by their very nature would require isolation from the community, well, all this helps us to identify the rock art here as a product of personal sacred use. Well, the question that immediately comes to mind then is, why would someone travel so far from their homes and their usual surrounding sacred areas, like Petroglyph Point, for example, to create rock art on top of a mountain? Rock art that nobody else could see. And those of you who know anything at all about shamans, you know that this is not their typical behavior. Typically, they go out of their way to demonstrate and display their supernatural abilities. But this is a private site that appears to contain medicine which they usually boast about. Well, my first clue came from Vern Ray's ethnography on the Modoc. Now, like his mentor, Leslie Spear, who worked on the Klamath Reservation a few years prior to this, Ray devoted considerable space in his ethnographic text here to on the Modoc to a discussion on shamanism. And chapter 5 in particular offered the most direct information that's relevant to this site. And what I'm talking about here, of course, is his discussion on the shaman's spirit quest. So a shaman's spirit quest. Now, the shaman's spirit quest was somewhat different from an ordinary power quest, especially with regards to its complexity and its overall goal. In the ordinary power quest, for example, the goal is to secure supernatural assistance for difficult life pursuits, such as hunting, gambling, warfare, becoming a village leader, being a good trader, a good public speaker, and so on and so forth. Now, notably, the spirits being sought out for this kind of a quest are fairly general, with none of them specializing in any particular ability. But the kind of spirits sought out by an aspiring shaman were specialized and offered very specific powers that were relevant to the shamanic profession. Powers such as clairvoyance, weather control, the ability to exorcise malevolent spirits from the community, and of course, the ability to diagnose and cure cases of sickness and disease, which was their primary role in the community. So accordingly, then, these are the kind of spirits that shamans obtaining these kind of spirits in the shaman spirit quest as medicines was the ultimate goal for the shaman spirit quest. Now, the shaman spirit quest itself was a threefold procedure that consisted of the spiritual call, the acquaintance with the spiritual universe, and finally, the acquisition of particular spirit helpers, otherwise called their familiars. And it's going to be necessary for me to review this process in order to provide some context for this petroglyph site. So, briefly then, the spiritual call. That's better. Now, the spiritual call came in the form of a dream. Now, the spirits that had appeared to the dreamer at this stage were vague, and the dreamer didn't remember them upon awakening, but these dreams continued for about 5 days, thus making an impression on the dreamer and signaling that there was a kind of a calling going on here. And at their conclusion, the dreamer would decide whether or not to pursue training as a doctor. At this point, the supplicant, the dreamer, still had a choice without risking illness or death from spirit sickness. Now, following the spiritual calling, the seeker would devote 5 more days, excuse me, you paid for these, or 5 more days to a quest in which he or she sought out personal contact with spirits. Under the tutelage of a veteran shaman, the initiate would visit places where spirits were known to live. The most common of these places, of course, according to Ray, included the deserted house pits of deceased shamans, places where they had performed their rituals, excuse me, the former gathering places of mythological being, once again, like Petroglyph Point, and certain pits and depressions other than shamans' former dwellings, essentially the lowest ground available. Now, what would happen is that seekers would sleep at each of these locations in search of dreams, in search of further dreams. And notably, it was during these dreams that all the spirits of the universe would appear in a great procession, presenting themselves to the dreamer over a period of 5 days. That's one long continuous line for 5 days. It's a lot of spirits. Now, most of these spirits were animal spirits, according to Ray, but some of these spirits were humans in miniature form. And that should probably ring a bell with you. Now, by the 5th day of dreaming, all the spirits had finally passed in review, and at this point, on the 5th night, came the most dramatic event of the quest. The dreamer would essentially step inside a shaman's abandoned house pit and die, by which is meant fall unconscious. Now, upon falling unconscious, the dreamer would catch a glimpse of an apparition that vaguely resembled that of a partial human skeleton figure. And when it disappeared, the voice of the ghost spirit would announce to the seeker that he or she would now be a doctor, and then proceeded to give further instructions for the 3rd and final phase of the quest. Now, during this third and final phase, right up here, which was the acquisition of particular spirit helpers, their familiars, the seeker would stay at home with his or her family, observe various taboos, and then await the appearance of specific spirits. And once again, the spirits visited the seeker in dreams, but this time the spirits that appeared were far fewer in number than they had been before. They appeared individually and spoke directly to the dreamer, each delivering specific instructions along with a song, which the seeker would sing immediately upon awakening. And then following this, the attending family would immediately repeat the song in an effort to help the dreamer to remember it. And the reason for this, of course, is that without this song, even veteran shamans had no access to their spirits. So the family certainly wanted their family member to retain these songs, to remember these songs in order to be a successful shaman. Anyway, this went on for 5 more days, and notably, these are the spirits that appeared in this phase. These are the spirits that became the familiars, which the new shaman would use ritually for the rest of his or her life. Okay. So from Ray's ethnography, then, we're able to relate these petroglyphs to the spiritual procession that appeared before the dreamer during phase 2 of the quest, and in particular to the humans in miniature form we discussed, which actually I see as a pretty direct interpretation in and of itself. And normally, I'd be happy to leave it at that. And in fact, in previous presentations where I talked about this site, I did leave it at that because I didn't know any further anything else other than that. But in my second reference, the Modoc myths, Curtin actually takes us a step further and offers us a little bit more information. Information, as I said, that I didn't even know was available. So let's back up just for a minute. In 1884, Jeremiah and Alma Curtin from the Bureau of American Ethnology visited the Quapaw Indian Reservation in what's today known as Oklahoma. Now, while they were there, they encountered exiles from the Modoc War, and from them collected more than 230 myths, largely from one extraordinary woman named Koalakaka, located right over here. Now, what's important about these tales is that many of them describe the activities of shamans and their spirits. They're just usually couched in animal tales. But one tale in particular offers us a very direct and detailed account of the shaman spirit quest. And for that reason, I have to give Shane Foster a quick shout out here for pointing this myth out to me. You know, I hadn't known about it before, and he cued into it right away. So thank you, Shane. Anyway, taken together with Ray's information, we can use this Curtin myth to fill in missing details about the spirits and the power they had to offer to aspiring shamans. And this, by extension, of course, helps us to enhance our ability to understand this petroglyph site. Now, the quote in the slide here from Modoc Myth 127, the myth in question, describes how aspiring shamans seeking medicine spirits for the first time will go to a mountaintop where spirits were known to live, and then spend the next several nights doing things like piling rocks, breaking branches from trees and tying them into bundles, running up and down hills all throughout the night, all in an effort to provoke spirit dreams. Now, as the story indicates, it was during these dreams that various animal spirits would appear to the dreamer, and in so doing, become his or her medicine, just like we heard in Ray. But notably, as you can see at the bottom of the slide right up over here, some shamans actually acquired a human pair, that is, a man and a woman spirit, for a medicine, and that these male and female spirits enabled them to diagnose the cause and location of a disease by allowing them to see through the bodies of their patients. So in other words, having a human pair as a medicine is synonymous with possessing supernatural vision, which, is a primary spirit tool required by shamans, all shamans. And this is what I meant earlier when I was saying that these kind of spirits offered very specific powers that were relevant to the shamanic practice. You wouldn't get that in an ordinary spirit or a spirit using an ordinary power quest. So then, according to both Curtin and Ray, then, the appearance of humans in spirit dreams was an expected occurrence. And moreover, thanks to Curtin, we now know, okay, that these human spirits had a defined role in the shaman's doctoring profession. Once again, that being the power to locate and identify sickness, which is an important first step in the shaman's curing procedure. See, without it, shamans couldn't reach a diagnosis, and thus they couldn't effect a cure. So in light of our discussion, then, it seems likely that the human figures on this site represent the spiritual procession that seekers are said to have witnessed in their spirit dreams as described by Ray. More specifically, their appearance in rock art indicates that these human figures had become the seeker's medicine. By and large, the spirit quest procedure described by both Curtin and Ray are identical. Both accounts attribute spirit images to dreaming or trance, and both required efforts to induce dreams at special locations, i.e., places where spirits were known to live, whether it's up in the mountains or right down there in the village itself. And also, as we've already discussed, Curtin takes this a step further and identifies the particular powers that these human figures had to offer to the dreamer. That being, once again, the ability to see through their patients and diagnose the cause and location of their sickness. So with this in mind, then, we can regard the Holding Hands petroglyph site here as a place where an aspiring shaman had acquired spirit medicine that would identify him or her as a doctor, and then commemorated their successful quest by carving their medicine into the rock face. Okay, let me advance this here. So that brings us then to our next example, which has to do with supernatural curing. Now, just to give you a distinction here, the first site we just talked about, the one we just finished with, that was about acquiring supernatural medicine. This next subject, this next site we're going to look at, has to do with the use of that medicine. So in particular, it takes us to the rock art at our place our ancestors referred to as Ukotwash, or the wood knot. The pictograph site located there contains 4 main rock art panels, which of course are shown in the slide. Today, I'm concerned only with the main panel located right, not right there, right over here. Now, as you can see, the panel is basically comprised of white and red and white polychrome circles, although there is one notable exception. But based on the circles alone, we could easily conclude that what we have here is a medicine site, given this symbol's widespread identification as Kamokamp's medicine tool, which of course is his sun disk. See, in myth, Kamokamps uses the sun disk to bring people back to life, including himself. And so accordingly, the sun disk is identified widely in the myth as his medicine tool, his medicine. So if we were to leave it at that, then what we would have here is a medicine site that's quite similar to other medicine sites located throughout the Klamath Basin. But curiously, when you look closely up, I'm going to do it right this time, right up here, you'll see what appears to be a very faded symbol of something that looks suspiciously like a salmon. Now, when I first saw the site back in 2004, that's what I thought I was looking at. And this, of course, made me question the site's function as a potential medicine site. I mean, in the back of my mind, it's reeling, and I'm already thinking, what else might be going on here that required a picture of a fish? That wasn't something I was used to seeing at that time. But a couple months later, and upon closer inspection, I came to discover that the image that we're seeing here isn't, the faded image here, isn't actually a depiction of a salmon at all. Instead, folks, what we're seeing here is a picture of a human that was made to look like a salmon. Now here's the close-up again, along with the stipple tracing I did just to make the image stand out a little better. Now, as you can see, the image has a little head, outstretched arms, a large fish-shaped body, and a couple of legs that are spread in such a way that they emulate the angle of a fish's tail. Now, one other thing I need to point out here is that Kamokamcha's sun symbol has also been painted on his torso, keeping in mind that the sun symbol was his medicine. So at the end of the day, then, what we're actually seeing here is a picture of a human that could be easily mistaken for a salmon wearing Kamokamcha's curing symbol on its torso. And from this, the next most obvious question that demands our attention, of course, is why? Why? Well, to answer that question, we have to turn, not surprisingly, once again to myth, and in particular to the story of Lakakawas, which is Modoc Myth 107 in the CD version, and pages 1 through 7 in Curtin's 1912 book. And once again, it's going to be necessary for me to kind of review the relevant portion of this story in order to provide some context for this petroglyph site. So, briefly then, Lakakawas. Now, Lakakawas was a beautiful blue woman who lived on the south side of Klamath Lake. Young men from all over the region wanted her, but whenever they would attempt to approach her, she would change herself into an old hunchback woman digging roots before they could see her in her true, beautiful form. See, she could always tell when they were coming and coming to see her, and she would change herself. Apparently because they laughed at her, although I'm not sure from the story if it was because she was blue or because they saw her as an old woman burying or digging roots. I don't know. The story wasn't explicit on that. Anyway, but there was one young man now living on the west side of Klamath Lake who was blue, just like her. And he was like totally in love with Lakakawas. So one day, assisted by his father, the young man dressed up in all of his finery, and he wore a bright, beautiful disc as a sort of a crown, which had been given to him by his father. And then, of course, he set off to see Lakakawas, traveling under the ground. Well, true to form, Lakakawas knew he was coming, but because he intrigued her, probably because he was also blue like her, she allowed him to see her in her true, beautiful form, and the two instantly fell in love. Well, inspired by his success, the young man set out to see Lakakawas again on the following day. This time he traveled underneath the water, still wearing the bright, beautiful disc that was given to him by his father. Now, in the meantime, Lakakawas's brothers had returned home from hunting and were preparing to move out to their spring camping place, located, of course, at Ukotwash. So after taking down their lodge, the brothers set out in their canoe, but Lakakawas's blue lover had caught up to them by then, and he was holding the canoe in place from underneath the water, not allowing them to break away from shore. And apparently this struggle went on till about noon, and when he finally did let go, the brothers resumed paddling out toward Ukotwash while the blue young man followed them from underneath the water, keeping pace with the canoe so that he could continue to gaze upon Lakakawas. At some point, however, the elder of Lakakawas's brothers spotted a bright, shiny object in the water that appeared to be following them, and he thought it was a salmon. And so, without thinking, he speared Lakakawas's lover, killing him dead. Well, once they realized the mistake, Lakakawas's brother took her lover's body back to shore on the south side of Klamath Lake, where they started out from. And there they cremated him along with all the wealth that they could muster. Eventually, when the flames died out, the only thing that remained in his ashes was the brilliant sun disk that he'd been wearing. While seeing this, her brothers immediately told Lakakawas, take this disc to Kamokamsh, who could use it to bring her lover back to life in his sweat lodge at Nelox, Hagelstein Park. So Lycakowas took up the disc and departed right away. Now, about halfway on our journey to Niloxi, Lycakowas stopped to camp for the night, and there, and much to her great surprise, she ended up giving birth to a boy, which had been fathered by her blue lover just the day before. Needless to say, this was something quite unexpected. The next day, when she and her newborn reached Niloxi, where Kamokomps had a sweat lodge, there Kamokomps did in fact succeed in returning her blue lover to life using the sun disk. But Kamokomps, being who he is, envious of the sun disk's power of resurrection, and of course of its dazzling brilliance, well, he wanted to keep it for himself. And so he immediately willed the blue young man dead again. Well, grief-stricken, Lycakowas strapped the child to her back and attempted to jump into her lover's cremation flames. At the last minute, however, Kamokomps attempted to stop her from jumping in, but he missed her and managed only to rescue the baby. And so at the end of the day, then, Kamokomps was left in possession of both the sun disk and of the child, whom he would eventually name Isis. Lycakowas, of course, wasn't so lucky. Now, the three main points from the story that are relevant for our purposes include the following. 1. The confused appearance of Lycakowas' blue lover, which leads her elder brother to mistake him for a salmon and kill him. 2. Kamokomps' association with ritual curing in a sweat lodge, which essentially places him in the role of a shaman. And 3. Kamokomps' use of the sun disk, his medicine, future medicine, to successfully return Lycakowas' lover to life, which essentially identifies a sun disk as a supernatural medicine tool, a medicine tool potent enough to return people to life. Now, what we're seeing in the slide here, folks, is a painting of a human that was intentionally created to be confused with the salmon wearing the sun disk of Kamokomps on its torso. But this depiction is not simply a reference to the story of Lycakowas. What we're seeing here, folks, is a depiction of the part of the story where the magic worked, where the curing magic of the sun disk worked. In short, folks, this is an image of Lycakowas' blue lover, whom Kamokomps had returned to life in his sweat lodge using the sun disk. It's not a picture of a salmon. In fact, what we're seeing here is a picture of curing magic in action. And thus it provides the site with a strong metaphoric connection to Kamokomps' power to cure with the use of the sun disk. Essentially, it validates the sun disk as a supernatural curing tool. So this site is a medicine site whose function and whose validity is underscored by the presence of Lycakowas' resurrected lover. And this is the reason why we don't see just this symbol at this site. In fact, we see all sorts of painted discs right along with it. I mean, think about it like this. If one sun disk can bring people back to life, imagine the kind of power contained in dozens of them. So this place then, this special location, is laden with supernatural medicine, powerful supernatural medicine. And it's because we know the myth that we have the ideological tools to make this connection, as did our shaman ancestors, who would have relied on this medicine to cure or to ward off sickness. Okay. So that brings us to our third and our final topic, which once again is gambling. And as unusual as this seems, the ability to be a good gambler took medicine. And believe it or not, we have rock art sites right here in the Klamath Basin that are directly related to gambling medicine. Now, some of you guys may recall in my last presentation, which was my dissertation, that was over a year ago now, but I talked a little bit about the Klamath and Modoc subsistence schedule and how their activities all throughout the harvesting season included things like catching mullet, harvesting locusts, hunting larger game, and gathering duck's eggs in the lowlands before moving to the uplands to continue to hunt for large game and also to gather things like apaws, camas, various nuts and berries. Now, all during this time, runners would be carrying baskets full of resources from the camps to the villages. And like I said, this went on all throughout the summer and on into the late fall until the threat of snow in the uplands finally brought the harvesting season to a close. Now, at that time, the runners would return to the villages with the last of the harvest, and there they would join their families in rebuilding winter lodges. So, for some, then, this was a time to settle in and start preparing for the fierce mountain winters that we used to have. But for others, well, for others, the season wasn't quite over. See, for them, this is a time to make one final journey, okay, with the hope of increasing their annual fare. And the way they did this, of course, was through gambling. Each year, a large gambling and trading fair was held at designated locations all throughout the Klamath Basin, in which participants from all over the region would attend. Now, this is a huge intertribal event, and people from hundreds of miles away would show up to take part, even as far away as the Columbia Gorge. The people who actually had Celilo. So why would they come to our gambling games if they have Celilo, unless ours were a really big deal, which of course they were. Now, the main gambling game was the four-stick game called Sakals. This game was basically a competition between two players who were regarded by their communities to be especially skillful gamblers. Now, the way it was played is that these two men, and in this case, only men were allowed to play this game, at least officially. These two men sat facing one another on either side of a blanket or a skin. Each side possessed a set of 6 sharpened stakes, usually painted red, similar to the ones you see wrapped up in this bundle right over here in the slide. Now, these sharpened stakes were used to keep the score, and to win the game, you had to win all of them, all 12. Now, on on the blanket between the players was a set of 4 marked gaming pieces like the ones you see here, and a skin or a woven mat called a pa'ala, which was meant to conceal these pieces during play, located right here. Now, to play the game, the players alternately took turns either moving the gaming pieces into particular arrangements under the concealment of the pa'ala or guessing their arrangement. Now, both sides either won a stake or lost a stake, depending on whether the guesser correctly guessed the arrangement. And as you can see in the slide up here, the gaming pieces offered only so many possible arrangements, and each arrangement came with a particular term. Now, backing up a second. Even though the contest was between two skilled opponents, less skilled players could still hope to increase their win or wealth by casting their bets on the side of their champion gambler. Whole families would get involved in this, and in fact, according to Dorsey and Spear, who wrote most extensively on our gambling games, whole villages would get involved, and the stakes would pile up just phenomenally. And while the two champion gamblers continued to play, onlookers would join in by singing their power song, invoking spirits in hopes of giving their side an edge. Now, why am I telling you all this? Becoming a successful gambler took the kind of skills that professional gamblers strive for today. And what I'm talking about is the keen intuition to recognize your opponent's tells. Okay, calculating the chances of a winning hand based on things like, oh, how many cards your opponents draw, or how much money they bet, or the likelihood that one was bluffing, their level of desperation. For example, are any of them holding their breath? Are any of them sweating? Or any of them shifting their gaze about erratically? Things of that nature. So this is what I mean by tells. And being a successful gambler required one to have the tells to detect and interpret them properly. But among our ancestors, skill alone wasn't enough to compensate for the problem of luck. See, no matter how skillful you were still dependent on the proverbial roll of the dice. Luck was something that your skills could not control. Well, our ancestors regarded the concept of luck as a liminal state, where successful transitions could take place when one had the proper amount of supernatural assistance, otherwise called medicine or spirit power, which of course would give them an edge. So even in gambling then, spirit power was a necessity. Well, just as with the Power Quest, which we've talked about in the past, those who wanted gambling medicine had to make a special journey into the wilderness to find it. But this wasn't the ordinary power sought out in a general Power Quest. Persons seeking gambling medicine had to receive it directly from Old Man Owl, otherwise known as Mokus, who was the owl spirit. Now, I did this stipple tracing over here so you can actually see what's in this petroglyph beside it. According to our Ms., Mokus had been the greatest gambler in the world before Crow had turned him into a stone. Now, one of the reasons behind his success, of course, was his amazing vision, which enabled him to hunt at nighttime, just like owls do. So, in other words, the owl could find things hidden in dark places. Well, by way of metaphor, this made the spirit owl's vision a very suitable gambling medicine because it enabled the gambler to see into their opponent's minds and discover their secrets. Or differently stated, owl medicine gave the gambler the power needed to discover their opponent's tells, while they arranged the gaming pieces under the concealment of the pa'ala, or when the arrangers reacted to the guesser's preliminary guesses. I'll explain that in just a moment. So owl's medicine was a must-have for those who were serious about gambling. Now, the way that gamblers acquired owl's medicine was by making a pilgrimage to the Owl Rock, where they observed various protocols very similar to those observed in the ordinary Power Quest. This would involve, of course, days of fasting, piling rocks all over the landscape, running up and down hills. And in addition to this, one also had to bathe in the owl's sacred pond. And all of this, of course, was done only at night. And despite the accumulating exhaustion and delirium, supplicants were also required to literally play the main gambling game of Sakals against the Owl Rock itself. Well, after days filled with these activities, the Owl Rock was said to move and then speak directly to the supplicant, granting him its power and giving him special instructions. And when the supplicant eventually awoke, he often found a newly made set of gambling sticks lying right beside him, thought to be a gift from the owl spirit. Apparently, this was a sign that the quest for gambling medicine had been successful. Now, in this slide, the owl created in the rock art appears to be looking at the viewer over its wing. If you notice, one of the eyes comes with a zigzag instead of an iris, located right here. Now, some of you may recall what I said in our last discussion, like I said about a year ago, about the spirit of lightning and its ability to give shamans enhanced supernatural vision. And in fact, I showed where the owl and the lightning symbols are frequently associated because they mutually enhance one another's power. Both the lightning and owl spirits, in fact, are associated with the ability to see in dark places. Or in gambling terms, the ability to discover secrets. Well, I propose that the zigzag in this owl's eye represents the lightning spirit, and that it was placed here to provide an enhancement to the owl's already extraordinary vision. Or to put it differently, here the owl spirit not only possesses its own already amazing supernatural vision, but it also has the assistance of the lightning spirit, to help enhance it even more. Well, the message here is clear. Anybody acquiring a power from the Owl Rock is promised to possess a type of ultra supernatural vision, and thus possess skills that will enable him to become a superior gambler. See, with this kind of supernatural vision in your favor, you could discover any opponent's tells or secrets, and thus outplay them in games where enormous quantities of wealth was at stake. Now, on another part of the site, overlooking the only place where the gambling supplicant can crawl out of the pond after following the owl swimming protocols, we have another pair of rather wicked-looking eyes located right down here, which greeted them and instilled, shall we say, the proper attitude when they woke from their power dream along the bank on the next morning. And actually, you can see the rather wicked-looking set of eyes located over here, meant to instill in the supplicant, well, a healthy appreciation for the spirit owl's supernatural vision. After 5 days of all these activities and then wakening exhausted out of this power dream, lying half in the water and seeing this look back at you, you're not going to forget that anytime soon. And as long as you remember it, you have its power. Now, returning to this slide for a moment. One other thing I need to point out here is this circle surrounding an unidentifiable quadruped in head down posture. And in English, I just said there's an upside down stick figured animal in this thing's stomach. This figure is important because it forms a reference to the way the game of the calls is played. By and large, owls are renowned for their preference to consume their prey head first and for regurgitating the waste in the form of owl pellets, essentially expelling the parts that were not beneficial. And thus we can think of this figure as a quadruped, possibly sitting in an owl's stomach that had been ingested head first. Well, at some point, like I said, our ancestors equated this process with the game of Sakals, and here's why. In the game of Sakals, the guessers were allowed any number of preliminary guesses as to the arrangement of the sticks concealed under the gambling mat, but without being committed to those guesses. And in turn, their opponent was at liberty to change the arrangement of the gaming sticks as many times as he chose. Now, all during this time, when practice guesses were being made and the gaming pieces were being secretly shifted and reshifted under the gambling mat, the guesser's watching his opponent very closely, reading his tells, building up his power, as it were, in preparation for making the official final guess, which he would signal with a particular gesture. So, in other words, the guesser is attempting to absorb the wisdom of his opponent, the secrets and tells hidden in his mind, while at the same time discarding information he deems to be non-beneficial. Just like the owl consuming its prey head first and regurgitating the rest. You see the parallel here. Well, this symbol provides us with a very strong metaphoric reference to that process. Anyway, back to the game then. Now, at the proper signal, all hands would come away from the gambling mat, and then the guesser would make the official final guess. And then, of course, the sticks are revealed. At this point, everybody's committed. Now, if it so happens that the champion gambler manages to lose a significant quantity of his family's winter stores and that of those who cast their bets alongside him, well, he wisely and immediately heads for the hills to reseek his gambling medicine. while tempers cool and alternate winter arrangements are made by the rest of the family. Needless to say, he was usually gone for a week, sometimes a little longer. Although some attributes of the owl spirit in general can also be used for other things like diagnosing and curing sickness and disease, finding lost objects, and even predicting the future. Depictions of the owl spirit for these purposes are generally located on other rock art sites that contain, different spirit images. But owl rock sites, like the one we just saw, the one we're working with here today, were specifically designed to facilitate people's efforts to become better gamblers or to regain gambling medicine that they felt they had lost. Now, I'm personally aware of 3 owl rock sites in the Klamath Basin, but I'm reasonably certain that there are many others. Now, our Ms. routinely talk about the owl rock in singular terms, where down and out members of the community, often in the personage of a little boy, lose significant amounts of wealth gambling against members of a rival tribe. In those tales, it's usually the mother or the grandmother that sends the little boy off to visit the owl rock to regain his gambling medicine. Well, my claim is that the Owl Rock petroglyph site in this presentation is one of several located throughout our traditional territory that collectively represent the Owl Rock alluded to in myth. And I'm going to break from my notes here for a second. I think that every village group had an Owl Rock, okay, that they visited for gambling and whatnot. But when people collecting the myths came around and asked them to tell their stories, and they had to refer to an Owl Rock, they talked about the one owl rock they knew about, and that's why in the Miz it's referred to as a single owl rock. Well, that's the single one they knew about, but I've encountered a couple so far, and I'm sure there's others. So I think everybody had one. Every village group had one. It's just that the storytellers in the Miz were referring to the one they knew about. Okay, in case you want to know. Now, in the story of Latkakawas, which we discussed above, Kamokop sends his newly adopted son, Isis, off on a series of quests for supernatural power. This also included a quest to find gambling medicine from Mokas, Old Man Owl. Now, according to Myth 107, Old Man Owl had been the greatest gambler in the world before Crow had turned him into a rock. Nonetheless, per Kamokop's instructions, Isis could still find gambling power at the Owl Rock if he approached the rock, asked it for the power he wanted, and then followed the owl's various protocols that included the following: piling rocks, that included swimming in the owl's sacred pond, and, as previously mentioned, actually playing a game of Sakals against the Owl Rock itself. The marked boulder in this slide here, made up to look like an owl, situated next to a year-round pond and surrounded by more than 40 stacked rock features, is one of the various owl rocks that exist throughout the Klamath Basin. And notably, it contains all the components necessary to facilitate ritual activities related to seeking gambling medicine. Okay. So that's all the examples I had for this presentation. But I'd like to offer some concluding remarks about the differences that are becoming more and more apparent in our rock art, because that's what's going to lead me to my next field project and my next quest for more knowledge. I started noticing differences in Klamath Basin rock art while I was doing my thesis work back in the earlier 2000s, but I didn't attempt to address them at that time. Frankly, I don't think I would have known how. Later, by the time I was doing my dissertation work, I made these differences the focal point of my research. But even then, I came to realize that the differences in the rock art were based not just on their location, like I had proposed in my dissertation, but also in how the images were made. what Ben Schwartz would have called their rendering techniques. For example, scattered in a few places throughout the Klamath Basin are these incised rock art compositions that sometimes are no more than a series of straight and cross-hatched lines, but also sometimes show up as iconic imagery, which unfortunately I don't have an example to show you at this point. The photos I took didn't turn out so well, but I've seen sun symbols and I've seen triangular figures scratched out or incised just like this. But I didn't control the lighting well enough to get a good photo for the slides, so I can't show it to you. Anyway, as I said, this kind of rock art is scarce, okay, showing up at only a few places in the Klamath Basin. But in every case, these groups of scratched lines appear in their own isolated section of larger rock art sites whose other designs were made by painting or engraving or some other technique. Now, the fact is, folks, and oops, and here's the skinny here, folks. I have no idea what these are. These scratch lines are, or why their creators decided to incise them rather than follow the conventions that they had used on the rest of the site, like painting. But the consistent way that they're made, coupled with their consistent appearance on larger rock art sites whose other symbols were made, in different ways, this all suggests strongly that this was a cultural decision. Okay, there's a cultural reason why they did it. And as such, this merits further study. Now, up to this point, we've come to see that rock art has to do with our ancestors' relationship with spirits. Differences between types of rock art is showing us the different ways that these spirits serve the community, from health and wellness to weather control, if you're familiar with the rain rocks, and of course now, how to help us become successful gamblers. Well, this raises serious and exciting questions about what this new type of rock art has to tell us, and how it will, in fact, expand our understanding of our sacred past. And to end with the useful cliche, a necessary one, much of our work, folks, still lies before us. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop and turn the floor over to you. Well, I can't really do that because there is no floor today. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope you got a lot out of today's presentation. And well, just thank you, and I look forward to next time.